All right, the next section or the next block we're going to build is what I call the showcase block. So in this block, we're showcasing an aspect of this website, like its control panel. Now on mobile, this is pretty straightforward. We simply have a one column grid with an image and a bunch of media objects. But what about desktop? Well, let me bring up the guides. So as you know, the first and last lines represent the boundary of our page or our container element. But look at this iPad. Part of the iPad is outside our container. So here's what's going to happen. If the user is on a small screen with a low resolution, let's say on a screen that is 1140 pixels wide, then they're only going to see this part of the page, the container element. So they are not going to see this part of the iPad. That's going to be outside the screen. But at the same time, the user is not going to experience horizontal scrolling. Now, the wider the screen, the more of the iPad is going to be visible. So that is the tricky part of this component. I want you to spend 15 to 20 minutes on this. Do your best to implement this on your own, then come back to my solution. All right, so on mobile, this image should be responsive. So it's going to stretch to take up all the available space. But on desktop, this image is not going to grow beyond this size. So if you have a really wide screen, we're going to have some padding around this block, okay? So in reality, this is the largest this image can get. Let's grab our ruler and do a quick measurement. So the size of this iPad is 674 pixels. That is the widest it can get because the resolution on most mobile devices is under 500 pixels. So we're going to assume the base size of 674, or let's just round it to 700. We're going to assume that as our base size. Then we're going to supply the 2x version for Retina displays. So here in the images folder, we have the iPad image. Let's open it with Photoshop. Good. Now we're going to resize this. So the 2x version is going to be 1400 pixels wide. Now let's save this as, I'm going to go to the resized folder and save this as iPad at 2x. Good. Now the standard version, that is going to be 700 pixels. Good. So this one is going to be ipad.png. Perfect. So we're done with this step. Now we need to convert it to WebP. So I'm going to go convert this image and come back real quick. All right, our images are ready. So let's add them to our project. Good. So here in index.html, we're going to start a new section and give it a bunch of classes. Block, block dark, and block skewed right. Now in this block, we have this h2 element. So first we add a header with the class of block header. And inside this header, we add an h2 and say user-friendly control panel. After the header, we need to add a container, which happens to be a grid. Well, a 2-column grid. Good. Now in this grid, first we're going to add our image. So for simplicity, first I want to add an image element. So I don't want to worry about adding a picture with multiple sources. I don't want to bring too much complexity in one go. So let's solve this problem step by step. First, we want to work on sizing this image and making sure that on a small screen, part of the iPad is going to be invisible, okay? So we're going to load images/ipad.png. This is going to be the first item in our grid. Now for the second item, I just want to add a paragraph with some text. So we're not going to add any media objects, okay? We just want to work on the layout. Here's what we get. Now the heading is blue. So to make it white, we have to go back to our markup and give this h2 element a class of block heading. We added this class earlier to make any kind of heading in this block white. Now, I think this was kind of unnecessary because in a block, eventually we're going to have some kind of heading, h1, h2, h3, and so on. So back to our style sheet, let's find the rule for block heading. So here's the rule I was talking about. In a dark block, any kind of heading should be white. Now, with this implementation, we have to remember to add this class to our headings. Nothing wrong with this, but what if we change this rule to something like this? In a dark block, if we have an h1 or an h2 or an h3, that element should always be white. Of course, we could extend this to h4, h5, and h6, but currently we don't have any headings like those, so I don't want to solve a problem that doesn't exist, okay? With this, we can go back to our markup and remove this extra glass. So we get a white heading, and if we decide to change this element from H2 to something else, it will still be white, okay? Now let's talk about this grid. So currently we're seeing the tablet version. Let's look at the mobile version. Okay, the first thing we need to address is the responsiveness of the image. Our image is fixed size, so it's not responding to screen changes, right? So back to our markup, we're going to give this image a class like block-showcase, that's the name of our block, _image, okay? Now, back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new section called showcase block. And here we define a rule and say, in a block called showcase, if you have an image, the width of the image should be 100%. Now we have a responsive image, so if we resize the browser, our image also gets resized. Beautiful. Now, what about the tablet version of our site? On tablets or wider screens, we don't want to show the entire image in this column. In other words, we don't want a responsive image. We want to show the image in its actual size, so part of it will end up outside the screen if the screen is not wide enough, okay? So we're going to write a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels and redefine the rule for this image, block showcase image. Here we're going to set the width to auto, and with this, the image will be displayed in its actual size. So look, here's the actual size. Now with this implementation, now we have two columns. The first column is very wide, the second column is squashed. So I'm going to inspect this element. Here on the elements panel, you can see our grid here. Let's click on it to see the overlay. Okay, look, the first column is way too big because the size of this column is determined by the size of the image. We don't want that. We want to make sure that we have two columns and each column is taking exactly 50% of its parent. So on a tablet or a wider screen, we want to redefine the column template for our grid. So if you have a block called showcase, and in this block we have a grid, the template for this grid should be like 50% and 50%. Previously we had 1FR and 1FR. So the available space would be divided into two slices and each column would take one slice. Now if we change this to 50%, 50%, that means 50% of the width of the container. So the width of the column will not be determined by its content, like the image. So we're done with this rule. Now we need to add this class to our block. So here's our section. Earlier we assigned these generic classes like block, block dark, and so on. Now I'm going to give this element a specific class like block showcase, okay? So in the showcase block, our grid, which is right here, is going to have a different template. So let's save the changes and see what we get. Okay, I'm going to toggle the grid overlay one more time. All right, look, we have two equal columns, great, but part of the image is under the text. To prevent this from happening, we need to align this image to the right side of its column. So back to our media query, here's the rule for our image. Which property should we use to align this to the right side or the end of its column? Justify self. You've seen this before, right? So we're going to set this to end, and now our image is in the right position. Great. And we don't have any horizontal scrolling. So the other part of the image is now off the screen. Now I'm going to expand my browser window. Where is it? It's right here. So look, the grid is getting wider and so is the image. This is not what we want. Because earlier I told you that our image should never grow larger than this size. So here we set the width to auto, but we also want to apply a max width of 700 pixels. So the image doesn't get larger than this size, okay? Now take a look. So back to the browser, I'm going to zoom out by pressing Command and minus on Mac, or if you're on Windows, you have to press Control and minus. So look, here's what we have built. So on a really wide screen, we're going to have all this extra space around our grid. So our image is not going to get larger than this. We can verify this. So we press Command and 0 or Control and 0 to get back to the standard zoom level of 100%. Now I'm going to make my browser wider. So look, the image is not growing larger. We're just getting some extra space around here. Great. So I believe the layout is working fine. Now, back to our markup, we need to wrap this image with a picture element to provide different types of sources. So let's select this line, then we wrap it with a picture. Good. Next, we add our sources. So the first one, its type is image/webp, and the source set is images/ipad.webp for 1x screens and images/ipad at 2x.webp for 2x screens. Pretty straightforward. Now, let's duplicate this, and for the second one, we're going to change all these WebPs to PNG. Good. Back to the browser. Our layout is broken, so let's inspect the image and see what's going on. All right, here's our image. On the right side, we can see the styles we applied to this image. So we set the width, max width, and justify self. That justify self doesn't work anymore because this image is no longer a grid item. Because we wrapped this inside a picture element, so the picture element is now a grid item. So back to our markup, here's our image element. We need to take this class from here and assign it to the picture element. Okay, now back to our style sheet. We need to make a small change here. These two properties, width and max width, should be applied to the image, not the picture element. So I'm going to cut these from here and write another rule and say block showcase _image. So here we're using the direct child selector to target this image. Again, we could assign this element a particular class, but I find it unnecessary because we're not going to change the structure of the picture element. We always have an image inside a picture element, okay? Now, you might prefer to rename this class from image to picture. That's totally fine. So we have made these changes. Now, we should also make a change here. So we don't want to apply the width of 100% to the picture element. We want to apply it to the image so the image is responsive, okay? So once again, we need to target this image, okay? All right, the problem is solved. Beautiful. So we're almost done here. The next step is to replace this paragraph with our media objects. So back to our markup, right after this picture element, we have the paragraph element. We're going to replace this with what? With a UL with 3 list items. So we're writing semantic markup. We could just use divs, but divs have no meaning. Now we're telling search engines and screen readers that here we have a list of items, and each item is a media object. So now inside the first item, I'm going to add the markup for our media object. So let's go to media.html, copy this entire code and paste it here. Let's see what we get. Good. Now we have this bullet point we have to get rid of. So earlier we defined a reusable list class for removing these bullet points. So back to our markup, here's our UL element. We're going to give it the class of list. All right. Now that totally screwed with the color of our paragraph. So let's inspect this element. So here's our UL element, and this is the definition of this rule. We set list style to none, padding left to 0, and color to this color. We shouldn't have applied this color here. That was my mistake. Because the whole purpose of defining this rule was removing the default styles applied to list elements. So we just want to remove the bullet points and reset the padding. Setting the color is all about skinning. So technically we should have defined this somewhere else. Now, if we remove this property from here, these lists that we have in our cart are not going to have this dark color. So what should we do here? Back to our style sheet in the list section. Here's the rule for all lists. We're going to remove this property, the color, and move it right here. I think it's safe to assume that whenever we want to display a list of items that have tick marks before them, we want to use a dark color because we want to get the user's attention. Maybe my assumption is wrong. The more we learn about this problem or this website, the more we can refine and standardize our styles. So for now, I don't want to spend too much on this because we'll get distracted from our main problem. All right, back to the browser. The problem is solved. Beautiful. Now, these H3 headings are a little bit thicker than what we have in our design mockup. So back to our topography section. Here we have a rule for H3 elements. I'm going to set the font weight to 500. Now take a look. All right, that is better. Now look at the bottom of this block. We have some weirdness going on here, and that has to do with the angle of this line. Now earlier we defined this rule for blocks that are skewed to the right. I used 80% as the y offset for this point. I think this number is not right, and with this we end up with a line that is really steep. So I'm going to change this to 90%, and also over here, for blocks that are skewed to the left, we want to use 90%, but earlier I showed you that how we can overwrite this clip path in a different block. So let's search for clip path. Look, in the hero block, we override this property and used 90% here. Now this line is unnecessary because we have solved the problem for all blocks that are skewed to the left or to the right. So I'm going to remove this entire rule. Good. Now, back to the browser, the weirdness is gone. So we have added our first media object or first media component. Now I'm going to pause the video and add the other media objects. All right, here's the end result. One problem we have here is the space between these media objects. We need to apply a bottom margin to separate these items. So back to the section where we defined our media component, I'm going to apply a bottom margin of, let's say, 4 amps to all media objects. I think this is a safe assumption to make because on a real web page, we almost always have a list of media elements stacked vertically. So we want to add some space between them. For the same reason, we need to apply a bottom margin to all paragraphs, okay? So now back to our design. That looks good. Now, what about the mobile version? So everything looks great. Now, if you compare this with our design mockup, you will notice that the text here is slightly larger. Take a look. So on our design mockup, the size of this text is 20 pixels, but here we're using 24 pixels because we defined this at the body level. Now, I'm not sure why the text in our design mockup is smaller in this block. This could be an accidental mistake by the designer, or it could be deliberate. Now, in this particular case, I don't want to worry about resizing the text. I think our page already looks great, but when we put everything together, we can come back and revisit this part. So I believe we're almost done. So here's the mobile version, and we have this beautiful line over here. Now let's look at the tablet version. And finally, the desktop version. Okay, great. I think we're pretty much done with this component. Just one last thing. What if we select the text? Look, the selection on a dark background doesn't look good. So here in the topography section, we're going to use a pseudo element selector called selection to specify the color of the selected text. So here we can set the background to our primary color and the text to white. Now take a look. That's much nicer. And this applies across the board, whether we are on a dark or a white background. So we're done with this block. Let's move on to the next block.